Well, everyone wants to talk about the things that the Qur'an, the scripture of Islam, and the Bible have in common. And they might say, listen, they're not so different. Adam is in the Bible and in the Qur'an. Same with Noah. Even New Testament figures like Mary and Jesus are both in the Bible and the Qur'an. People should really see they're really, really similar. Well, some of these characters are in both scriptures, but are told or presented in dramatically different ways. And there's no more dramatic difference than with the story of Noah. Why? Well, Noah, in his ark and the animals and the flood. Seems like a nice story, although it's really a dreadful story of divine punishment. But in the Bible, Noah gets into the ark with his 3 sons and is saved from the waters of the flood. But in the Quran, there's only one son, and that son does not get into the boat or the ark and does not survive. He's lost in the waters of the flood. So why is there this dramatic difference between what the Quran and the Bible say about Noah's sons or Noah's sons? We're going to speak about Noah's lost son, and I'm going to delve into this mystery and solve it all for you. For those of you who do not know the story of Noah from the Bible, the Quran, maybe you've seen the movie about Noah featuring the gladiator here. By the way, spoiler alert, this movie has like a totally different take on Noah. He's like an ecological warrior out there in like a really profound, against human exceptionalism kind of way. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about the movie about Noah. I'm here to talk about, what the Quran and the Bible say about Noah. So let's just delve right into the famous Quranic passage. This is in chapter or surah 11, which is named Hud. We won't worry about Hud. That's another character in the Quran who's not in the Bible. But we're going to speak about the story of Noah and his lost son in the Quran. So beginning in verse 42, we read, "And it sailed along with them amid waves," that is the boat. The waves were rising like mountains. Noah called out to his son, the son is not given a name, who stood aloof, "O my son, board with us and do not be with the faithless." He said, "I shall take refuge on a mountain. It will protect me from the flood." Noah said, "There is none today who can protect from God's edict except someone upon whom he has mercy." Then the waves came between them, and he, that is the son of Noah, was among those who were drowned. You don't have to pay too much attention to the image on the right-hand side of the screen. Here, I asked AI to give me a presentation of the flood, and clearly the AI is insane. But let's focus rather on Quran chapter 11. So we have the story which seems to stand out dramatically from the story that we find between Genesis 6 and 9 in the Bible. In that story, of course, Noah has 3 sons. Noah has his wife. The 3 sons all have wives. And so there are 8 of them who get into the ark and are saved. But in the story, we only hear about one son of Noah, and he does not get into the ark. And of course, the story is presented really dramatically, where the son, thinks he knows better than his father, who's also a prophet. So, the story is, on the one hand, I suppose, a little bit about obedience to parents, but it's principally about obedience to prophets and to God's will. The son is like, "I don't need your help. I'll just go up to a mountain and I'll be fine." And of course, he is not fine. And then a really key bit, and we're going to see why it's so important by the time we get to the end of this presentation, unfolds in the verses that follow in Quran 11, because intriguingly, Noah doesn't sort of take the death of his son sort of just for granted and just let it pass by and move on. But rather, he calls out to God and complains specifically about the death of his son. Obviously, the whole world is kind of destroyed and lots of people are dead, but he calls out to God and complains about the death of his son. So you see there in Quran 11:45, "My Lord, my son is indeed from my family. Your promise is indeed true." And then God responds sort of personally in one of these passages the Quran gives us of this sort of intimate conversation between God and his prophet. God says, "O Noah, indeed he is not of your family." Remember that line, we'll get back to it. Instead, he is controversy over this line. It could be, it is unrighteous conduct. So do not ask me something of which you have no knowledge. So Noah sort of rebuked there, like, why are you contending with me? I'm God. I decree things. I decree good and evil. Your role is to accept and submit and obey. And in fact, in verse 47, there seems to be a declaration of contrition or remorse by Noah, where he says, if you do not forgive me and have mercy upon me, I shall be among the losers. Again, you don't have to pay attention to Darth Vader if you don't want, but there's a story about his son, and I mean, I guess it's kind of the lost father, maybe, in that story in Star Wars. But okay, let's carry on. Let's carry on to Qur'an 11. I just want to note that there is sort of an anticipation of the conversation that will later unfold between God and Noah, because in Qur'an 11:37, before the bit we read about the flood, God gives instructions to Noah and says, build the ark before our eyes and by a revelation, and do not plead with me for those who are wrongdoers. They shall indeed be drowned. That's really interesting. I mean, theologically, morally, ethically, all sorts of questions could be asked there. I mean, first, again, we see kind of the principal vibe of the Qur'an's theology, namely that God's decree is not to be contended with. God punishes whom he wills, as the Qur'an says on many occasions. And I mean, God seems to anticipate maybe that Noah will contend with him or complain about the death of his son, and is kind of anticipated by this verse, which says, do not plead with me for those who are wrongdoers. Now, this is more than just the story of Noah in the Qur'an. Later in this same chapter or surah, we see God reprimanding another figure who's a prophet in the Qur'an, Abraham, for complaining or sort of lobbying for the salvation of the people of Lot. This is a scene which is connected to the latter part of Genesis 18 in the Bible. And just as God reprimands Noah in regard to Noah's son, God reprimands Abraham in regard to the people of Lot. And he sort of says, "Oh, Abraham, let this matter alone. Your Lord's edict has already come, and an irrevocable punishment shall overtake them," the people of Lot. Okay, so we're going to get back to Abraham actually in regard to his father, but here we already see a parallel between Noah and Abraham. Now, there's a lot that can be said about this. The passage in regard to Noah, seems to be telling important tales which are closely, intimately connected to the Qur'an's theology in regard to obedience to God, in regard to the threat of divine punishment, but also, and this is a really key bit in what, will be the focus here going forward in this presentation, also in regard to obedience to God over obedience to one's family, sort of faith over family. And this does play out, as I alluded to, in another bit that, or another selection of passages that connect to Abraham and his pagan father. Now, that's probably material for a whole another presentation on exploring the Quran and the Bible. But the Quran, following a number of Jewish and Christian traditions, not in the Bible, but that developed before the Quran, understands Abraham's father. In the Bible, his name is Terah. In the Quran, his name is Azar. They understand Abraham's father to be not just kind of among a pagan people, but an idolater, someone who actually makes idols, not only sort of venerates them, but makes idols. And the Quran, as do these earlier texts like Jubilees and Apocalypse of Abraham, has conversations between Abraham and his father, in which Abraham seeks to dissuade his father from venerating these idols. And so, you have these passages, as in Quran 21. Here, Abraham says to his father, "What are these images to which you keep on attending?" And notice the complaint or the response of the people is, "We found our fathers worshiping them." And then another passage when Abraham said to Azar, his father, do you take idols for gods? I see you and your people to be in clear error. And yet another one, peace be to you. Now, this is a really key bit where Abraham promises to pray for his father's forgiveness. Okay, and he says basically, I've got a special connection with God. God is gracious to me, so God will probably forgive you for your idolatry. Now, notice these passages from Quran 21, 6 and 19, by tradition all Meccan passages, that is proclaimed by Muhammad between 610 and 622 in Mecca. But we have another key passage, which is Medinan passage, Quran 9, where the Quran very sternly says that believers should not pray for the forgiveness of unbelievers. And the Quran, as though it's aware of those passages in Quran 6, etc., it kind of circles back and kind of explains how this decree of Quran 9, this Medinan surah, so between 622 632, this decree about not praying for the forgiveness of unbelievers, how that can sort of go together with the stories about Abraham, where he does promise. I mean, Abraham's a prophet, so he doesn't do anything wrong, right? And there he does promise to pray for the forgiveness of his father. So the Quran, aware of a tension here, seems to add something meant to resolve it. Verse 114, Abraham's pleading forgiveness for his father was only to fulfill a promise he had made him. But when it became clear to him that he was an enemy of God, he repudiated him. So, I mean, it sort of fills in something that's not really clear in the Meccan passages, namely that at some point Abraham said, oh, actually, my father, he's an enemy of God because he's an unbeliever. And so I won't actually ask for his forgiveness. And I mean, this is really key actually for the Noah passage. So we finally circle back to Noah, because both of these stories, in a way, seem to be manners in which the Quran is seeking to distance believers from the unbelieving members of their family. Okay, we're going to circle back to this also in regard to the context of Mecca and Medina, in particular in the lifetime in the context of Muhammad. There's one further anecdote that has to do with tension between a believing and unbelieving family member. Again, this is probably material for a whole different presentation, but the Quran has another intriguing difference from the Bible in regard to Moses, because the Quran suggests that Pharaoh, evil tyrant of Egypt, was actually the adoptive father of Moses. And Pharaoh sort of, in this passage in Quran 26, Ash-Shu'ara, kind of appeals to Moses's feeling of filial piety or something. And then Moses is, if you read the whole passage, Moses sort of rejects that and says, listen, what matters is obeying and submitting to God. Family ties are not that important. Okay, and then, one other passage which from Quran 46, Ahqaf, which seems to tell the same story or make the same argument, has to do with just kind of a theoretical, maybe hypothetical, metaphorical son. The Quran is sort of saying, this sort of scenario can unfold with children. It speaks about good children, and then this case of a bad children who says, oof, fie on you, about having to take care of his old parents and all of this. But it's pretty clear that this is the case of the unbelieving son of believing parents. So similar to the Noah case, and the opposite of the Abraham case. So the problem with unbelieving son is not that, he's not making his bed or cleaning up his room. It's his unbelief. He says, do you promise me that I shall be raised from the dead when generations have passed away before me, etc., etc. And so you can see that God is going to punish this unbeliever. Implicitly, he's an enemy of God. Verse 18, such are the ones against whom the word has become due. There's an intriguing reference there to nations of jinn. Who are these nations of jinn? But again, we'll get to that maybe at some other point. But we see this is actually a very significant theme in the Quran. What do you do when families are split with an unbelieving son? or an unbelieving father. And how do believers in this situation deal with this? I mean, that's already kind of an important takeaway of this talk, that this theme in regard to Abraham or Moses or the anonymous infidel son probably is connected directly to the context of early Islam, where the community has real-life situations in which a believer has an unbelieving child or an unbelieving parent. And the Qur'an says, essentially, when God says to Noah about his son, he is not of your family, that your new family is the family of believers, and you just, be tough here and just sort of cast away the unbelieving members of your family. Do not even pray for their forgiveness. I mean, if that sounds kind of harsh, by the way, as a non-Muslim, it's not my role to counsel Muslim theologians how to actually make a takeaway about this. Muslim theologians or ethicists, can do lots of this, and they could say, well, that's a very particular context, wartime, stuff like that. But in the 21st century, things are totally different. You should love the non-believing members of your family, not only pray for them, but give them support, accept their decisions, believe in freedom of religion, all of that. I mean, that's a legitimate position. So the point is not to say this is the essential Islam or something, okay? Just to make it clear. And to make it maybe even clearer, I mean, the Quran is drawing on a theme that's already present in the New Testament, where also we see faith over family. So, here we have in the Gospel of Matthew, where, Jesus is proclaiming, do not think that I've come to bring peace on earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. What does he mean? Well, not holy war, but he says, I have come to set a man against his father. Think of Abraham and his father in the Quran, and a daughter against her mother, etc., etc. Okay? And the point, again, is faith is more important than family. Look at verse 37. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. So again, a love of Jesus in this case is more important than love of a family member. Okay, now let's circle back kind of to bring things all together in an incredibly eloquent and sophisticated manner. Let's circle back to the story of Noah. Now, okay, we have this interesting passage that we saw in Qur'an 11, where one of Noah's sons, in fact, in the Quran, the only son that's mentioned is a disbeliever and dies in the flood. And then we have that one passage that we've been speaking about where God says to Noah, he is not of your family. Okay, and now there's another verse here that can be brought into play and was brought into play by Muslim commentators of the Quran traditionally, which is in Quran 66, by the way. Medinan Surah, that may not matter very much here. So, I mean, although it's possible that it's kind of developing or explaining something Quran 11, which is Meccan, but leave that aside for a moment. God draws an example for the faithless, the wife of Noah, and the wife of Lot. So that's kind of a curious combination. Why are Noah and Lot being brought together? And what is Noah's wife doing here at all? I mean, the wife of Lot, both in the Quran and the Bible, she seems to be an example of, faithlessness or disobedience. I mean, she is punished in the Quran, the Bible. She's turned specifically into a pillar of salt in Genesis 19. But here they're brought together. I mean, we hear nothing about Noah's wife causing trouble, neither in the Bible nor in the Quran. So why is she brought into the picture here? And then things get more intriguing as you continue to read the verse, because it says they, that is the wife of Noah and the wife of Lot, betrayed basically their husbands. So it's the dual form, khanatahuma. Those two women betrayed those two men. Now, the word betrayal, khanat, in the feminine, or khanata in the dual, is key here because this can mean, it's not all that it means, but this word can mean to betray in the context of marital infidelity. So to be with another man other than their husband. Now, wait, I remember in Quran 11, it says that, God says that literally, that Noah's son was not actually his son, or, just to be faithful to text here, is not of his family. So one interpretation out there that basically remained a minority position, but it's there in the classical commentaries, is that Noah's son who was lost in the flood was not really his son at all, but was the fruit of a unfaithful relationship between Noah's wife and another man. That's nice because it kind of explains Chanata in this case, or Chanat in the case of Noah's wife, and it explains that passage of he is not of your family. It remains a minority position. Most interpreters, they just don't like the idea that a prophet could be a cuckold, and so they reject that interpretation. Also, from a more sort of literary or historical critical point of view, that would kind of ruin the lesson of Quran 11, which, after all, really seems to be obeying God over family members or prioritizing God above family members. And if Noah's son is not actually his son, then that lesson, is not articulated by the story in Quran 11. Now, I mentioned that in Quran 66, Noah and Lot are brought together, and that's kind of unusual because Noah's wife doesn't show up as a bad character in the Quran or the Bible. So you're like, what are these doing together? Well, they're actually brought together not in Genesis, even though they both appear in the book, but not in connection with one another, but in the New Testament. So Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, he uses the story of Noah, and then immediately thereafter, the story of Lot, to advance an admonition or a warning about the immediacy, the suddenness, the unpredictability of divine punishment. And then it comes up again in another book of the New Testament, not in the Gospels, but in 2 Peter, where the author says he did not spare, that is, God did not spare the world in ancient times. He saved only Noah, the preacher of uprightness. By the way, has a really important point that the New Testament author of 2 Peter identifies Noah as a preacher because he does not preach or warn people, at least explicitly. It's not mentioned in Genesis, but already by the New Testament, he was made out to be a preacher. And in the Quran, of course, he does warn and preach. Anyway, that's another point. The key point here is that once again, as in the Gospel of Luke, in 2 Peter, Noah and Lot are brought together. So you can see at first there's a bit about Noah, and then verses 6 and 7, Lot, who incidentally is made out now to be an upright man. Again, that's very close to what we find in the Quran and not exactly what we find in Genesis. So we could see kind of a clear trajectory where the characters of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible are becoming more pious, more perfect. They're also becoming preachers. So this happens with Lot. Not the preaching bit, but the uprightness, who had been sickened by the debauched way in which these vile people behaved in 2 Peter. Okay, so Noah and Lot are brought together. But, really the way to unravel the story or to explain the difference that we find in regard to the three sons of Noah in the Bible, in the one lost son of Noah in the Quran, is connected to another Old Testament book, in my humble opinion, which, it's almost inevitably correct, in one of the major prophet books, Ezekiel, who's not mentioned in the Quran, Ezekiel. But Ezekiel in this passage is wrestling with the idea that God might punish sort of collectively families or generations because of the sin of one person in that family. And so Ezekiel, in order to offer a different theological position, starts telling a story about, the righteous men, the most righteous men. And he singles out Noah, Daniel, and Job. Okay? And so, great examples. If you think that they're kind of all connected, Noah is the only upright man, more or less. in his time. Daniel, in the context of the exile and the paganism around him on Mesopotamia, remained faithful. Job remained faithful despite the trial, the horrible trials that he went through. So it makes sense he chooses these three figures, right? So that's very thoughtful. But then look at verse 16. Even if these three men were in a land, says the Lord God, they would deliver neither sons nor daughters. So their goodness would not redound to their children, right? So, we'll just read a little bit further because it's explained even more. Verse 18, though these three men were in it, they would deliver neither sons nor daughters, but they alone would be delivered. Remember, Qur'an 11, Noah, the same Noah, sort of, he is delivered. He makes it out onto Mount El-Judi in the Quran. Actually, that's another difference between Quran and Bible. We'll leave that aside for now. And then again, it's repeated. Verse 20, even if Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, as I live, says the Lord God, they would deliver neither son nor daughter. Okay, so what I'm proposing here, everyone, if you're still with me after this journey through Quran and Bible, is that the book of Ezekiel is proposing sort of a hypothetical scenario in which Noah, along with Daniel and Job, is the righteous man in a land that has been condemned, and yet his son, who's a sinful or unbelieving man, does not benefit from his father's righteousness and is punished, is not delivered. So the Quran, in a sense, is sort of making real, in the story of Quran 11, what is sort of metaphorical, what is something like a parable or an allegory in Ezekiel 14. We're going to circle back to that point. I just want to note that, this passage in Ezekiel and another passage similar to it, also in Ezekiel, was noted by Christian authors in late antiquity, including those who wrote in Syriac, who lived very close to the time and place of the Qur'an's origin. So this is Jacob of Sarug, who dies in the 6th century, so just a generation or two before Muhammad. And Jacob of Sarug writes, the soul of the Father and the soul of the Son both belong to the Lord. It is the soul of the sinner from which vengeance shall be sought. A just father will not profit a sinning son. He will save neither a son nor a daughter. So this idea was obviously important in the context of the Quran. The Quranic difference seems to be in making what is hypothetical discussion in Ezekiel into a story which is real about Noah and a real sinner, a real unbeliever who's lost in the flood. One way of describing this making real a hypothetical situation, a parable or a story, as sort of a real event is, we can call it personalization. Probably a bad word. I couldn't come up with a better one. I should have asked an AI, as I asked an AI to create this weird image on the right side of the screen. But by personalization, a hypothetical person becomes a real person. So that's the Reynolds use of this term. And the story of Noah's son would not be the only case of personalization in the Quran, because in Quran 38, we have an interesting story of two disputants. These two disputants apparently are real men who show up in David's chamber, is in Quran 38, 22. And, they ask basically David to judge between them, and then they speak about sheep and things. And they ask David to settle the matter. You can read the passage for yourself, but it's closely related to a hypothetical story or a parable, which the prophet Nathan, not mentioned in the Quran, tells David to sort of impress upon him a sin that he has committed, in which there are two hypothetical men who are disputing about sheep. And yet in the Quran, they become real men. So a case of personalization. Okay, I think I mispronounced that word, but I mean, I hope you forgive me that and forgive, sort of any disorganization and all my other faults. This is an interesting case to me because basically brings home the point that the Quran and the Bible are similar, but they're also profoundly different. And part of what we do on exploring the Quran and the Bible is to show, respect each scripture for its own character, and that means attentiveness, both to similarity and to difference.